All right, thanking God for, among other things, his willingness to forgive, which is not always easy for us as people. But thank God, as the word says, his thoughts are higher than our thoughts and his ways are higher than our ways. And with that, let's call the very last chapter of Micah. What did we want to call it? Let's call it steadfast. Yeah, because part of his willingness to forgive, I guess, can be seen in the fact that he is described over and over again in the Psalms and even here as having a love that is steadfast. In this chapter that, however, describes the decline or the descent of Israel, as many of the prophets do, Micah, however, will do it beginning in roughly the first 6 verses, talking about a woe that is likened to summer fruit. Summer fruit. I'll start out by just reading verse 1, where he'll say, "Woe is me, for I have become as when summer fruit has been gathered, as when the grapes have been gleaned. There is no cluster to eat, no first ripe fig that my soul desires." An illustration that he will use for the way in which, in verse 2, he will say, "The godly has perished from the earth," as he will go on for the rest of that section to describe not only the way in which the upright seem to have essentially either gone extinct or just become almost impossible to find, to talking about the way it has proliferated the society beyond the intentions of those who found joy in the unrighteousness that replaced the upright, saying in verses 2 and 3, the way in which so many have lied in wait to basically hunt one another, the way no one is trustworthy beyond the bounds that they might have originally expected when they began to take advantage of those far away from them, or at least their households. He's going to talk about the way in which the day of their punishment has come in verse 4 to make it obvious that the evil they did afar has now crept even into their closest relationships. And thus, in verses 5 and 6, he is going to talk about the way in which it seems that even many of their most trustworthy relationships have become untrustworthy in the condition to which the society has fallen, as verse 7 will say. His relationship to this environment finds him in a situation where he says he will wait. But in verse 8, he is going to go on to talk about his enemies, understanding that part of his waiting, part of what has him stuck in this condition is the fact that he's caught up in the results of his own sins. But he's telling his enemies, don't rejoice, because as we have seen in previous chapters, his now is not his forever. And the fact that he is acknowledging his sins seems to have something to do with the fact that he is trusting that God will eventually redeem him. So if you take a picture of his now, his next chapter in life is quite possibly going to look very different from the low that he seems to be caught in right now, along with those around him. Verse 11, however, will go on to shift to talk about the way that the decline in society has not just affected relationships, but the entire environment, using a term we have seen other prophets use, talking about the desolation it will bring to the earth, literally in verse 13, because of the fruit of their deeds. Understanding, as we often say in Jesus's own ministry, he starts off in the Sermon on the Mount toward the end talking about with the dead horse issue. Measure we use, it will be measured back to us. Some of the consequences they are suffering are not so much the direct punishment of God as much as it is God simply allowing them to suffer the desolation that is a natural result of the choices they have been making. Going on, he's going to talk about in verses 16 and 17, the way that the nations will be brought low and ashamed at even their might, saying, the nations shall see and be ashamed of all their might, of all things to be ashamed of, quite possibly because their might isn't getting them anywhere in trying to overcome or survive and thrive in this kind of environment. But he's saying it will produce ultimately, like we say, a silver lining, understanding that many will turn to God. The chapter ends in verses 18 through 20 this way, where it says, "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever because he delights in steadfast love." That's our title. "He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea. You will show faithfulness to Jacob and steadfast love to Abraham, as you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old." passage in verse 18, once again, talking about the remnant, which is a reminder that once again, whether it's his people or the Goyim or the nations, he is not handing out blank checks, blanket salvation to anyone who wants to do whatever they want on their terms, understanding that this chapter describes a turn, and a turn that's better made sooner rather than later, understanding that Micah's confidence comes in the fact that he is acknowledging his own wrongdoing and sooner turning rather than waiting till the later we see at the end of the chapter, where the nations turn, in a phrase that I left out, in dread to the Lord. Reminding me that a low-key problem with turning in dread throughout the scriptures is this. Pharaoh, at the time, he was contending with God essentially to keep the people of Israel in bondage. In the Exodus, he repeatedly turned when the pressure got turned up too high. Likewise, we saw in the book of Jonah, Nineveh turned to the Lord, only to make the 360-degree turn that we described in Jonah that we'll see again in the very next book of the Bible, Nahum. And likewise, the turning in dread here comes with a lingering question mark. That reminds me why we sometimes say, my prayer for you is my prayer for me. God, can you please help us to produce turns that are just as steadfast as your love?